Bom dia.
Começamos?
Bom dia.
Sim.
Bom dia.
Estamos ao vivo no YouTube.
Sou eu?
Sim, professor Alexandre, podemos iniciar.
Então, bom dia. Sejam bem-vindos ao primeiro Seminário Internacional Questões de Moral, Moral em Questão, Sociologia e Antropologia do Bem em Tempos Desafiadores. Eu sou o professor Alexandre Werneck, do Departamento de Sociologia e do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Sociologia e Antropologia da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro. É uma enorme alegria estar dando início a esse evento que foi longamente gestado, e vê-lo finalmente acontecendo é um alívio enorme, uma grande alegria. Eu vou, enfim, em seguida falarei também algumas palavras, mas antes de qualquer outra coisa, eu quero passar a palavra antes de qualquer outra coisa, eu preciso dar alguns avisos, algumas informações técnicas. Essa sessão contará com tradução simultânea. Aos usuários, há um botão na linha inferior, abaixo da tela, no extremo direito, escrito Interpretação, com um globinho. Vocês podem clicar nesse botão e vocês vão ter aí as línguas disponíveis de áudio. Se você clicar em português, vai ouvir português. Se você clicar em inglês, vai ouvir inglês, de modo que fiquem à vontade para utilizar o recurso que lhe for mais adequado. Sem mais delongas, eu vou passar a palavra para a professora Suzana de Castro, diretora do Instituto de Filosofia e Ciências Sociais, que vai fazer uma breve fala de introdução ao nosso evento. Muito obrigado, professora Suzana.
Bom dia a todas, todos e todes presentes nesse encontro. É um prazer enorme recepcionar esse primeiro seminário internacional de questões de moral, moral em questão, né? Sociologia e Antropologia do Bem em Tempos Desafiadores. O IFIX como foi dito pelo professor Alexandre Werneck, é o Instituto de Filosofia e Ciências Sociais, e para a gente é uma enorme honra estar recebendo pesquisadores nacionais e internacionais durante esses dias de 28 a 30, em formato online. Tenho certamente certeza que, se fosse num outro momento da nossa história, a gente estaria nos encontrando presencialmente no próprio Instituto, que fica ali no Largo de São Francisco. Então, eu quero desejar a todos ótimas interlocuções, trocas, e que o evento seja um sucesso. Eu tenho certeza que será.
Obrigado, Suzana. Eu agradeço por sua fala e passo agora a palavra à professora Letícia Ferreira, coordenadora do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Sociologia e Antropologia da UFRJ e uma das organizadoras do evento, por acaso.
Obrigada, Alexandre. Bom dia a todos, todas e todes. Eu queria saudar a diretora do IFIX, professora Suzana de Castro, presente aqui conosco, a organização do evento, aqui representada pelo professor Alexandre Werneck, do Departamento de Sociologia do IFIX, e queria saudar também todos os presentes que estão conosco aqui no Zoom ou logo ali no YouTube, né, onde estamos sendo transmitidos simultaneamente. Eu estou aqui na condição de coordenadora do PPGSA, o Programa de Pós-Graduação em Sociologia e Antropologia do IFIX, da UFRJ, e queria marcar a importância desse evento para o programa. Esse seminário é uma iniciativa que congrega diferentes membros do nosso corpo docente, que estão na organização e que também apresentarão trabalhos nas mesas redondas. Mas é também um evento que congrega membros do nosso corpo discente, temos alunos de mestrado e de doutorado que apresentaram trabalhos nos GTs e alguns dos nossos pós-doutorandos, que estão atuando também como coordenadores ou como debatedores dos GTs. Digo isso para ressaltar a relevância de uma iniciativa que foi capaz de ter adesão mais geral da comunidade do PPGSA e ainda de reunir essa comunidade aqui com professores, pesquisadores e pós-graduandos de instituições de todo o Brasil e do exterior, que têm contribuído de modo decisivo para os estudos sociológicos e antropológicos da moral e das moralidades. Esse evento marca a inserção de professores, alunos e pós-doutorandos do PPGSA em um circuito internacional de produção intelectual em torno dessas temáticas e em debates bastante consolidados nas ciências sociais. Isso, por si só, já evidencia a importância desse evento para o programa, mas há ainda algo mais que eu gostaria de destacar em função da conjuntura que a gente atravessa. Em momentos como a atual pandemia que nos assola já há tanto tempo, em que o isolamento e o distanciamento social se tornaram imperativos para a preservação da vida, uma iniciativa como essa, capaz de produzir encontro e reunião, sobretudo com tamanha qualidade e diversidade de participantes, é algo muito precioso. Então, em nome do PPGSA, eu parabenizo todos os envolvidos nessa empreitada e desejo dias de encontro, no sentido mais denso dessa palavra, e dias também de debates ricos e proveitosos para todos. Muito obrigada.
Obrigado, Letícia. Antes de passar a palavra para a nossa conferencista, eu quero falar muito rapidamente sobre o histórico e a importância para nós desse evento. Ele é uma iniciativa conjunta do Núcleo de Estudos da Cidadania, Conflito e Violência Urbana, da UFRJ, do qual eu faço parte, e do Laboratório de Antropologia do Estado, Regulação e Políticas Públicas, Documenta, que é coordenado pela professora Letícia. E ele tem uma longa história de gestação que começa, acho, numa iniciativa conjunta minha e de Luís Roberto Cardoso de Oliveira, aqui presente, de organizar nos encontros nacionais da Associação Nacional de Pós-Graduação em Pesquisa e Ciências Sociais, ANPOX, um GT, um grupo de trabalho, desde 2010, de Sociologia e Antropologia da Moral. Dessa iniciativa, vários outros movimentos, como encontros com o grupo da RAM, da Reunião de Antropologia do Mercosul, em torno de moralidades, a produção de alguns livros importantes, entre os quais eu queria destacar o Pensando Bem, o livro que organizamos eu e Luís Roberto, reunindo os trabalhos desse GT, depois também coordenado por outros colegas, como a professora Patrícia Schuch, aqui presente, a professora Jussara Freire, o professor Gabriel Noel, todos envolvidos de alguma maneira nessas frentes essas que se expandiram não só para GTs, mas também para SPGs, para grupos em outros encontros e por aí vai, de modo que a gente estabeleceu um contínuo de debates já de mais de uma década em torno dessa temática, que se consolidou, inclusive, com uma forte presença de estudos de moral e moralidades no âmbito do PPGSA e em outros grupos de pesquisa do qual todos nós fazemos parte. Eu queria dizer também que, quando a gente começou a conceber esse seminário, no final de 2018, os tempos desafiadores aos quais a gente estava se referindo não eram exatamente os tempos desafiadores que estamos vivendo hoje. A gente não fazia ideia de quão mais desafiadores ou tão desafiadores eles iam se tornar ao longo dos anos. Então, eu queria sublinhar um pouco essa, digamos, infeliz coincidência, né, de a gente ter captado esse momento da história e ressaltar a importância de a gente se manter discutindo essas temáticas que vamos discutir aqui hoje com o máximo de cuidado e atenção possível. O Brasil, o mundo de maneira geral, notadamente no nosso atual momento político, histórico e por aí vai, mas o Brasil é notadamente um país de enorme complexidade moral que merece enorme atenção do ponto de vista dos estudos da sociologia, da antropologia da moral, e eu espero que esse encontro também sirva de um convite muito especial para que pesquisadores e pesquisadoras de várias áreas se concentrem mais nesses temas, deem atenção particular a eles e possam cada vez mais contribuir para esse debate. Quero agradecer mais uma vez a presença de todos os participantes, tanto aqui quanto no YouTube, e, evidentemente, nossos integrantes de mesa redonda, integrantes de GT, os nossos conferencistas, e especialmente a professora Mônica Heintz, que apresentará essa nossa conferência de abertura, que eu agora apresento. A conferência se intitula Disentangling Moral Complexity in Rapidly Changing Societies, Discourses and Actions. A professora Mônica Heintz é professora do Departamento de Antropologia da Université Paris-Nanterre e co-diretora do Laboratoire d'Ethnologie e Sociologie Comparative da UPN, e, entre outros trabalhos, é autora do livro The Anthropology of Morality, que está aqui recentemente lançado pela Routledge, e espero que possa ser objeto de atenção de vários de vocês. Ela é também organizadora do livro The Anthropology of Morality, lançado em 2009, e suas pesquisas na França e no leste europeu se concentram em antropologia da moral, da temporalidade e em teoria antropológica. Eu quero passar agora, com grande alegria, e começando para celebrar aquilo que eu espero seja uma longa parceria, a palavra para a professora Mônica, e com a certeza de que teremos agora uma fala de extrema importância. Muito obrigado. Mônica, agora a palavra está com você.
Thank you very much. First, I would like to thank you warmly for inviting me here, even if this here, when our world has been reduced to a window in the cyberspace, may be more abstract than one would wish. It remains a precious way to be able to communicate some of the results and concerns we have as researchers. So thank you to the organizers of such an engaging and resilient conference, Professors Alexandra Werneck and Leticia Ferreira, and thank you to Professor Luís Roberto Cardoso de Oliveira for so graciously agreeing to discuss some of the ideas I would present here under the quite ambitious title of Disentangling Moral Complexity in Rapidly Changing Societies, Discourses and Practices. I would simply hope in this talk to discuss some of the directions for exploring such complex moral conundrums, which this conference will surely take much farther, both theoretically and empirically, over the 3 days of the conference that I am thrilled to attend. Well, to start with, as all anthropologists and sociologists need to think through a story, and perhaps their audience need it too, I will make no exception here. And I shall start this talk with an old story of nurses and mothers at a Romanian children's hospital during the transition from socialism to capitalism that Romania has experienced after 1989. Some 20 years ago, during what statistics proved to have been the worst and the last year of a 10 years constant economic decline following the fall of the communist regime in Romania, I was doing long-term ethnographic fieldwork in Bucharest, the capital of Romania. My research was focused on work ethic, which actually meant on discourses and practices of work in private and public enterprises. It had been quite clearly pointed to me that practices are observable, discourses are recordable, but the ethic is a bit of a cloudy concept for being directly analyzed. This was a wise advice. Also, it clearly reflected the non-recognition of ethics and moral values as an object of possible ethnographic inquiry at the time. As a result, in the field, I was busy working every day in a private firm, gathering some real ethnographic data, but also living the ordinary life of a mother of 2 children besides work. And it is with an ordinary experience of ethical or perhaps non-ethical life that I would like to start. My life led me to spend 10 days within a public children's hospital, sharing the lives and fears of mothers, accompanying their children there and wondering whether they will survive the hospital experience. Not that their children's illnesses were particularly scary. My own baby, for instance, had bronchiolitis. But the reputation of hospitals was particularly bad. Films such as the internationally acclaimed The Death of Mr. Lazarescu that came out in 2005 are inspired by real cases from that particular period. Mothers were obliged to stay in the hospital 24 hours out of 24. Fathers were not tolerated to take care of their children. And I had to share with 2 other mothers a small room with 3 cot beds and 3 stools for 10 days. Mothers were tolerated to sleep with their children in their cot beds. I don't know whether you know that a cot bed is a 60 centimeter per 120 centimeter bed with barrels. So they were tolerated to sleep there from midnight to 6 o'clock in the morning when there were no medical visits. But with 3 sick children in the room, quiet times were rare, nurses' visits at night with all lights on numerous, and the fear of overheating already feverish children ended by preventing mothers from resting at all. During the day, they would sit on a stool next to the cot bed and take care of their children, relying on each other for a few moments when they had to go to the toilet or to the canteen. Nurses and sometimes doctors were coming and going, inspecting children, but with no explanation for the mothers, either concerning the gravity of the case or the time scale of the illness and hence of the stay in the hospital. While doctors were rare and relatively polite, nurses were constantly scolding mothers for not being alert enough and not keeping the room in sufficient order. So apart from the hand-washed tissue nappies drying on the radiator, there was not much in the room to create disorder. Surely, the dense population of the room with no windows and the smell of the dirty nappies might have been an irritating experience even for nurses. This nightmarish experience for mothers was nothing compared to their constant fear that something bad could happen to their children. So they unconditionally obeyed the medical staff without questioning and constantly tried to smooth the relations. A small bribe in a nurse
Recording in progress.
Mothers, nurses, in principle, united in a common goal, the care of children, to be in constant tension and from the nurses' side, even in open conflict with each other. Nurses are poorly paid in public hospitals, certainly. But was the exhaustion of those relatively poor mothers indispensable? Had they always been acting like this during their whole professional life? Or was there something particular to the times of particular economic crisis they were crossing? Did they ever imagine doing things differently, them who were loudly complaining that their conditions of work and pay were not as abroad, meaning in Western Europe or US only terms of reference used at the time? Did mothers realize that they were feeding into a system of corruption and had their share of responsibility in maintaining a system that they otherwise decried? Was there nobody to police the system, the state or NGOs? This ethnographic example comes from the post-1999 transition period in Romania, when economic and political changes were unfolding quickly and generating economic and social crises, inflation, unemployment, poverty, and the emergence of new inequalities. Not only was the situation degrading, it also happened very quickly, depriving of meaning the transformation that was unfolding and which had initially been endorsed by most of the population. The contestation of the past, the pressing survival needs of the present, and the uncertainty of the future characterized the period. Generations were divided, social inequalities were growing, and ethnic claims periodically generating civil and political unrest that was poised to constitute a threat to the peace and sovereignty of the countries involved. While moral complexity is not reserved to such cases, a rapidly changing society, such as it was the case of Romania during the transition, is a laboratory where to observe values, as their change and conflict makes them more apparent and their disentangling more difficult. Vice versa, while looking through the lens of the anthropology of morality does not exhaust the way in which a rapidly changing society could be viewed, this view adds to the understanding of social phenomena in a promising and yet to be explored way. I will start with a presentation of the field of the anthropology of morality as different from ethnoethics. then I will look at some of the challenges and possible methods that could be used to explain field cases in which the moral dimension plays an important role. Finally, at the end of this talk, I will discuss critically anthropologists' social and political choices when dealing neutrally or engagedly with values in cross-cultural contexts, thus evaluating the ethical terms in which the anthropology of morality could be applied to the conflicts around us, from insidious state bureaucracy to open violence. So why shall we go beyond ethno-ethics? Let us turn to a brief history of the anthropology of morality, which is quite a short history, actually. At the end of the 20th century, as the strict norms of previous eras were vanishing, the Western world saw the birth of an ethical hypersensitivity. At least this is how Zygmunt Bauman diagnoses postmodern times. Ethical consciousness flourished and became the only barrier to the ever-growing liberation from traditional norms. This freedom of thought was counterbalanced by ethical self-surveillance, while self-control replaced collective control. No wonder this movement also found its echo in anthropology, where for the past 20 years, writings dealing explicitly with an anthropology of morality have flourished. Before that time, moral values had been intertwined with the social, and they have seen their influence decrease over time concomitantly with a decrease in the coercive power of the community. In the postmodern era, moral values took on strong personal discursive forms and once again became visible, albeit in a different form. Moreover, if Durkheim, with his holistic view of society, saw morality as a mantle floating over society and in harmony with its structure, the moral was the social itself, the capacity to live and grow together. In a postmodern era dominated by an individualistic view, there is a tendency to see the moral as part of the structure of the person. You can see that in virtue ethics, you can see it in the cognitive sciences of morality. The making of the person, the anthropology of virtue, and the biographical portraits of exemplary figures constitute a new trend in the analysis of the social. Moving away from the perspective of the moral equals the social, current approaches often propose that the moral equals the virtue itself. Neither of these approaches could account alone for the complexity of social reality. Furthermore, dividing the field of research according to Western dichotomy of the social and the self, or embracing the Western philosophical tradition that makes a distinction between ethics and morality, are not likely to be a step forward toward scientific precision, but rather a hindrance. A systematic effort towards the constitution of a separate field of reflection around this issue of ethics or morality was done by Didier Fassin and his group towards a critical moral anthropology. They allow to rescue in an intentionally comprehensive way the anthropological work that preceded the birth of the field and dealt in filigrane with moral questions. Even if Edel and Edel's call for a joint anthropological and philosophical approach to ethics seemed to receive no answer back in 1959, attention to moral values lurked behind studies of the social or the cultural during the entire 20th century. The companion to moral anthropology, collected within the same project by Didier Fassin, was aimed at providing a complete state-of-the-art of moral anthropology research. The diversity of entries shows the heterogeneity, eclecticism, and need for dialogue within this new field. As anthropologists think through their fields and subjects, most generalizations that are meant to be universally applicable are nothing but a reflection of the particularity of the field site chosen by researchers. However, one conclusion could be drawn from this important overview. A priori normativity could not frame research on ethics within anthropology, and this discipline's chief contribution to the study of moral values consists in its commitment to a descriptive, as opposed to normative, endeavor. The anthropology of morality is not a moralizing approach to social facts. I consider here the moral to be a dimension of social and personal life, not a separate field of the social reality. Michael Lambeck considers ethics a dimension of all human actions. I quote, a property of speech and action as mind is a property of the body. And James Laidlaw insists on the irreducible dimension of ethics and that, I quote, social theory needs to be formulated to make our analysis of diverse phenomena and states of affairs cognizant of this. I do not go as far as asserting the presence of ethics in all aspects of social life, but I favor ethics in the explanation of social reality as a much needed counterbalance to power and structures that have weighted so heavily in social analysis since the 1960s. Changing the lens might help anthropologists and sociologists see other aspects of the social reality and reinterpret them in new ways. And this is what authors who contributed to a volume I have edited back in 2009, The Anthropology of Moralities, did by proposing a new angle of inquiry or a new method capable of revealing the importance of the moral dimension in society. A few years ago, when I became interested in the foundation of a separate field of anthropology of moralities, my argument was that questions and biases encountered in the study of moralities urge researchers to develop a reflexive area of inquiry in which the methodological aspects are openly debated. The aim was to fine-tune the lens in order to make it more powerful and relevant. This distinct field would correspond not to a separate fragment of social reality, but to a separate field of reflection, wherein the problematization of the moral question becomes possible. However, such a field may no longer have reason to exist once moral values have been placed solidly on the map of reflexive anthropological inquiries. When the lens is ready for use, its legitimacy will come from the relevance of the observations it allows to make and of the interpretations it generates. For the time being sought, and despite the flourishing and high-quality contributions to the field, much more needs to be done to establish the study of moralities critically within social anthropology. Thus, this conference is a most promising and necessary contribution to an emerging field. Let us go into what I mean by defining morality in a cross-cultural context and to my arguments that linguistic diversity does not help. Studying morality cross-culturally is not an easy task, given the lack of universal definition of the term. If morality in English defines a set of principles and judgments based on cultural concepts and beliefs by which humans determine whether given actions are right or wrong, in some languages, the term morality does not even exist. And Caroline Humphrey brings a counterexample from her Mongolian experience, which does not mean that moral evaluation is unknown in these societies. Thus, in the case of morality, the terminology cannot be determined and fixed once and for all with a claim to universal relevance, thus constituting a hindrance to anthropological translation and comparison. The problem posed by translation and reporting on moral facts by the anthropologist encounters the problem of local expressions of moralities. How can we get around the ambiguity raised by translation while still acknowledging the central place of language in the process of elaboration of moral values? At the local levels, explicit verbal statements are not the only way in which moralities are expressed. And this drives researchers to look for alternative methods of grasping reality without relying only on language as a primary vehicle of communicating moral values across cultures. Maurice Bloch argues against the central place given by anthropologists to verbal statements collected from the locals in the field, claiming that some cultures might not be language-like, and that if they resorted to post hoc verbal rationalization, this would have no direct connections to their thoughts. Neuroscience research on moral emotions attempts to delimit a universal biological core, and this could give us clues about non-linguistic expressions of moral involvement, such as facial expressions or brain activity. Likewise, anthropological practice consists of looking at what people do in addition to what they say in order to evaluate morality in action. The inclusion of observations of practices complements various actors' recorded statements and raises new questions concerning the imperative to achieve correspondence between discourses and practices in a given society. Gilsenan's famous article on lying in Lebanon and John Barnes' research on lying bring examples of the cultural variation in the accepted and valued links between discourses and actions. Indeed, it becomes now impossible to postulate the existence of a culture of truth in which discourses and practices match each other. Returning to our definition of, the only option I can think of is that of getting closer to a working definition by defining morality, or what is right and wrong, in relation to what is accepted or rejected in a society, rather than pondering the linguistic cognates of the term morality in a particular culture. Rejection of moral actions can take several forms, from warning to disapproval, from light punishment to exclusion from the community, and from imposed exile to capital execution. The form of rejection is not directly proportional to the moral offense, given that factors other than morality govern the management of a community. Also, if we look outside the intersection between the moral and legal domains, between moral values and norms, which are implemented values, rules that are socially enforced and sanctioned within the society, we find that there are norms that either no longer benefit or do not yet benefit from moral endorsement, as well as moral values that have not been translated into social norms. Moral values and norms, morality and normativity, are interdependent, but in a complex way. Also, the study of norms in legal anthropology is a source of inspiration and knowledge. It does not offer a strict guide to the field of morality. It is not by chance that when we try to define morality, we actually look at forms of rejection rather than of acceptance. Whereas rejection is noisy and disobedience is visible, acceptance of norms is rarely mentioned and consequently is less amenable to scientific observation. Moral breaches are more easily identifiable than moral conformism. Applying the community acceptance rejection definition does not allow for the differentiation between moral, immoral on the one hand, and morally neutral facts, that is, facts rejected on grounds other than failure to respect moral values. This is a major difficulty in cross-cultural research, as anthropologists are subjected to a translation bias. Starting with a subject that is amenable to judgment of its being right or wrong in one society, researchers translate the statements and then collect information on attitudes of acceptance rejection from another society without asking whether the subject falls within the moral realm in that society or it's a mere convention. Most permissions or interdictions have some equivalent in other cultures, but not all equivalents carry the same moral weight. Conversely, there are actions that are neutrally judged in our society, but which could lead to moral judgments in others. But ethnographic direct observation, complemented by actors' post-event justifications and debates, led me to observe that when debates are heated, when actors actively search for solutions, eventually on a longer time scale, a moral component is necessarily involved. In the children's hospital, mothers spend their day complaining about nurses' behavior and discussing their best bribing strategies. Also, none of them openly describes their feelings as being hurt. This intuitive recognition of morality in action is dependent upon the researchers' recognition of emotions in a local setting, which again is not an easy task in cross-cultural research and requires strong familiarity with the field site, which of course was my case when sharing the same preoccupations and fears over the care received by my baby with other mothers. In a naturalistic approach to moral judgment, Nichols sees emotions as central to the success of moral values in society. Whatever is the origin of the rule, a moral value has a better chance of survival over time if associated with a strong emotional response. Also, moral psychology has not proved that emotions are a necessary component of moral judgment. A similar argument comes from a radically different discipline. The Marxist historian E.P. Thompson interprets the 18th century food riots in England as having been caused by a strong feeling of injustice in the face of price speculations, rather than by rational utilitarian calculus or a primary instinct of survival. The riots emerged when the peasant moral economy was endangered by new speculative practices, and not, as some historians had explained earlier, as apolitical rebellions of the belly. In a different historical context, 20th century South Asia, James Scott arrives at the same conclusion. Emotions and indignation in the face of outrageous behavior rather than pure economic need led peasants to revolt. The link between expression of emotions and moral values allows for a definition cum recognition of the later. So a working definition of morality, or what is right and wrong, should consider what is accepted or rejected in a society as manifested through a high degree of emotional involvement. This last aspect can be identified and evaluated only ethnographically and comparatively. Let me now turn to the difficulties in data collection and try to argue further of why looking beyond discourses seems necessary when studying morality. The need to overcome difficulties in data collection in the research on moralities prompts researchers to go beyond ethnoethics, the study of the explicit moral rules of a society, towards a more comprehensive anthropology of morality. The first empirical difficulty is the one that I have mentioned. It is that concerns the differentiation between a moral, immoral, and a morally neutral fact when cross-cultural understanding may be limited by the translation bias. The second difficulty in data collection comes from the plurality of moral frameworks in many cultures around the world and its intersection with power relations that are specific to each context. In Romania, at the time of my fieldwork, the domain of work relations was crossed by collectivist, socialist values, by Christian values, by capitalist values coming from real experience, some of them, and from imagined elements of an ideal Protestant work ethic. Different generations, social classes, rural versus urban origins, past experiences of work prompted people to adhere to a certain set of values rather than to another, and sometimes to change from one to the other, according to their mobile and intention of the moment. This heterogeneity made the generalizations about existing values impossible, except for the general conclusion that values had to be continuously interpreted, applied, and negotiated in particular life cases by the social actors. Discourses meant nothing without their application or their practice. The third difficulty in data collection in the field of morality is generated by inconsistencies between local statements of morality and observed deviant practices. Moral values are not easy to collect artifacts. They are social facts recreated scientifically by the scientists, sometimes asserted spontaneously by informants, and sometimes in response to solicitation, as in the very common case of certain moral responses being elicited through interviews, and sometimes exclusively reconstructed by the scientist on the basis of the actions or bodily gesture observed. The first issue is that we are forced to exercise some caution concerning the reality and objectivity of the statements collected. A moral statement provided by an interviewee does not have the same meaning if it has been prompted by the researcher or comes about spontaneously, if it is a reaction to one event rather than a reaction to another one, if it is about a past event or a present one, if it involves one person or another. The anthropologist should provide some minimal but meaningful context to situate even a simple statement made by the interviewee to help it to be interpreted within one moral framework or another, to be taken as face value or as provocative or as resistant. Nevertheless, practices form the even larger context within which discourses should be considered. If we do not place ourselves in an ethics of intentionality in which only intentions and principles, such as they are expressed, matter, we need to equally take into account what people really do to go beyond ethnoethics. Finally, this tension between discourses and practices help the actual ethics to unfold. The fourth difficulty in data collection comes from the progressivity and creativity of the moral phenomenon, which evolves under the pressure of time and circumstances. There is a complex negotiation between individual action and society's moral values. Moral deliberations are important. The interplay between different actors' subjectivity is important. The impact that action can have on values is important. Values change under the pressure of new practices, and the observation of the latest in conjunction with the first is indispensable for the explanation of these changes of values. Let me now turn to the methodological challenges in the study of moral complex configurations, which is the main subject of my talk today. If I manage to convince you that moral complex situations could not be understood by simply looking at what people say about what they would and should do, and that we also need to consider practices in a larger context, this is not to say that the path ahead for an approach to morality is easy. The new configuration of research that takes into account both discourses and practices faces us with some major challenges. The first challenge is that of taking into account the question of freedom of speech and action. Explaining the social realities through its ethical dimension could bring a new perspective and
Recording in progress.
This is the reason James Laidlaw argues in his 2001 Malinowski Memorial Lecture for the development of an anthropology of freedom as a prerequisite for the development of an anthropology of ethics, and the reason why Keith Murphy and Jason Stroop argue for the development of an anthropology of the will. The first task for the anthropologist is to take into account the methodological consequences of the interesting link between ethics and freedom and will. Let us get back for a while to the case of the mothers in the hospital and ask whether they were free to act differently and not bribe the medical staff in order to draw attention to their child so as to attract their sympathy and care. Perhaps mothers were free. I did not give bribes myself, but they didn't want to take the risk for their children. Were nurses free to act in a more considerate way towards mothers while being overwhelmed with work? Probably yes, but in times of extreme scarcity, by negotiating bribes, they negotiating their own financial survival. The problem with freedom is that it is not amenable to precise evaluation. Nobody is entirely free to choose or is totally lacking freedom of choice. On an imaginary scale between complete freedom and its complete lack, where were the nurses situated to make us conclude that their abusive behavior was a reflection of their own moral values? It was whispered that they were sharing the bribe with the doctors, that there was a whole system of redistribution of these private funds among the medical staff according to hospital hierarchies and probably imposed by the hospital hierarchies. The responsibility question has been posed in human rights courts
Recording in progress.
society. Thus, a second challenge is to bring the analysis of the social and of the individual back together with respect to the definition of moral dimensions of actions, discourses, and thoughts. Let us start here with James Laidlaw's explicit link between ethics and freedom and his implicit invitation to methodological individualism. Laidlaw reminds us of the implicit tension between societal values and individual desires contained in Nietzsche's denunciation of Judeo-Christian oppressive morality. More recently, Laidlaw goes on to argue that individual freedom of moral reasoning and choice is essential virtue ethics principles reconsidered in the second part of the 20th century by Elizabeth Anscombe. and combines that with a later reading of Foucault's notion of freedom. Surely, James Laidlaw's individualism is methodological and not metaphysical. He clearly criticizes artificial oppositions between society and the individual, stating that the latter is but a part of the former. But when he engages with contributions from US anthropological literature, also he rightfully criticizes some unnecessary concepts of agency, it is noticeable that he remains bound to an exclusive reading of social reality through the eyes of the Western modeled individual. A way out of this methodological dichotomy between individual and society is offered by linguistic anthropology, which inspired many of the contributors to a volume entitled Ordinary Ethics, edited by Michael Lambeck back in 2010, and which leads to an interactionist and dynamic approach to morality. The ethical action, including the act of speech, is applied through human interactions and is analyzed through the observation of these interactions with careful attention given to details, nuances, micro-changes, and levels of meta-thinking. The edited volume shows that ethics is part of the human condition, present in every social and human experience, from ordinary talk to cosmologies. The location of ethics between the spoken and the unspoken, between objectification and embodiment, with its attention to revealing the tacit and the implicit, as well as its sensibility to the difference between is and ought, is the strength of ordinary ethics. The variety of aspects covered helps make the important point that ethical sensibilities should be looked for beneath every action. And also this claim was also that of Durkheim, with the implicit risk that the ethical dilutes into the social. Here, the implications drawn is different. If every social fact can be morally charged, sometimes neutrally, this does not derive directly from equating society and moral commitments, but should be analyzed and proved in all its complex intertwinement between ought and is, which is present in every aspect of human life. More recently, Keane's work also explicitly confronts the dichotomy individual-society and clearly asserts that ethics is situated in the interaction between them. The linguistic approach inspires this position, and the psychological literature that backs Keane's work is full of promises towards a naturalistic approach to morality. What is not yet taken up fully is an engagement beyond discourses to a more holistic consideration of facts together with discourses and thoughts, intentions, which is certainly due to the broad aim of his overview of ethics as an ontological reality. To return to our children's hospital case, the question is not whether nurses or mothers were free to act according to their values and should be held responsible for the perverse relations between medical staff and patients established in the hospital. The question is how the dynamics engaged during their interactions led to these relations, what role structural power as opposed to particular characters played in the relations observed, and more generally, how concrete medical actions emerged during these interactions. All questions answerable through ethnographic means. The third challenge, methodological challenge for the anthropologist, is to follow the making and remaking of values through discourses and actions of individuals who share both common cultural ground and personal individualistic aspirations. This is the dynamics of moral values, or their development in time, their change in time. To invoke Nietzsche again in his The Genealogy of Morals, he focuses not only on the origins of Judeo-Christian morality, but equally on the constant reinterpretation and reformulation of this morality over the centuries. His project of re-evaluation of Judeo-Christian morality, needed because God was dead, was not revolutionary after all, but inscribed in the expected evolution of ethics. In the recent years, Western values have penetrated most traditional societies due to the circulation of people and images. The disruption they cause there takes on different forms depending on what moment we are referring to, the scale, the counter forces in presence. Ignoring this potential conflictual context when analyzing traditional cultural facts is preventing the objective interpretation of the facts observed. The perverse hospital relation I was mentioning growing out in a public hospital, are not indifferent of a cultural context where capitalism is in the process of replacing socialist values with the apparition of expensive private clinics where supposedly nurses had better wages. A notable approach to the dynamics of change is that of Joel Robbins in his account of the moral struggles of newly converted Christians in Papua New Guinea. Drawing on Salin's theory of cultural change and on Dumont's theory of values as aspects of the cultural structure, Robbins attempts to explain the rapid and definitive conversion of the Urapmin of Papua New Guinea to Christianity and their paradoxical and endemic self-perception as sinners. It is a conflict between Urapmin and Christian cultural values that brings about the question of morality, because morality provides a window through which the Urapmin see contradictions filling their lives. The traditional Urapmin moral system had at its heart a conflict between the egoistic will and the desire for the maintenance of sociability, which required altruistic behavior. For facilitating moral choices, an additional taboo system provided the Urapmin with clear guidelines for behavior. With all traditional beliefs, including the taboo system, discarding in the face of Christianity, the Urapmin are now left with only the conflict between will, whose existence is indispensable for the working of the traditional social structure organized around the act of willing of big men, and the Christian ideas of altruism and renunciation. Failing to reconcile the two, the Urapmin perceives themselves as sinners. Robbins' incorporation of the dynamics of change within its account, while remaining chiefly ethnographically convincing, paves the way for the search for a comprehensive and structured theory of change. The fourth challenge that I will remind of here is that of describing moral values during exceptional times. The moral dimension runs through social realities, through both ordinary and exceptional events. And the first question that arises is whether to make an analytical distinction. Is ordinary ethics to be analyzed differently from big moral dilemmas? Are different approaches to morality needed in different social realities? If there are different ways to capture the ordinary, constant follow-up observation, and the extraordinary, perhaps digging around the complex case study of a deviance, there are also more factors to be considered in the analysis of exceptional events: the urgency, critical life effects, trauma, and so on. Radical changes are characterized by a degree of uncertainty that provokes uncontrolled, unpredictable behavior. As the direction of the change and its meaning are not clear, the sense of history is rarely seen in real time by people who are living in it. These uncertainties are also linked to living in exceptional times of crisis, during which the usual landmarks no longer apply. We are all experiencing these uncertainties during the COVID crisis, so I shall not insist on this. But times of crisis are also times of excess and urgency, when people are victims of a numbing effect created by the speed of transformation, a byproduct of change. A recent ethnography of Israeli soldiers' moral behavior by Graziani shows, for instance, how the banalization, pressure, and urgency involved in soldiers' activities induces moral numbing. We all lived together during the COVID crisis and remember how the first deaths were deplored, while when their number increased, we only saw figures and forgot the dramas behind them. There is an intensity of change that provokes not only an acceleration of events, but also a breakdown of values. The research on the heuristics of decision-making, even in its limited rationality, sensitivity to psychological biases form, ignores the specific factors linked to exceptional time. Kahneman's treatment of risk situations or rare events is like that of normal times, with a strong belief in the predictability of situations and only some additional factors to be taken into account in extraordinary cases. However, field cases suggest that a different treatment of data collected in extreme conditions might be necessary. If the study of morality through deviance from moral norms is a valid form of analysis in stable contexts, what can the ethnographer learn about moral norms when a whole community changes in times of crisis? Radical changes, especially when they involve a sudden downturn, provoke disappointment, and in the search for the swift reestablishment of equilibrium, often lead to fraud, corruption, deviance, and blameful survival strategies. I have observed the situation in the hospital in 2000, during the worst year of the economic crisis following the fall of communism in Romania, when acts and decisions could not be framed and considered to be culturally representative. The particularities of radical change recommend extreme carefulness in manipulating context, as the adaptation towards deviant behavior by the local population is higher than usual due to the collective aspect of deviance during these rapidly changing times. Individual nurses acted in predatory way because all nurses in that hospital and in other hospitals acted in such ways. The fifth challenge and last that I'm going to evoke here arises from the tension and the hierarchy of values between Western and other societies' value systems, inscribed in various United Nations declarations and codes originated in the West, and that many countries have now signed. In the case of the Children's Hospital, both categories of mothers and nurses were under the fascination of imagined better Western relations of care. Of course, the illustration of several coexisting moral frameworks by way of this example is contentious. But moral justifications collected in the field do not take simple paths just to gain the sympathy of the audience. As for the anthropologist, she walks on shaky ground when echoing such local justifications or giving context information that opens up the way to interpretations that look more like excuses for an unforgivable act, at least unforgivable by Western standards. This last challenge and this last point actually naturally leads me to turn to the last part of my talk, which concerns some critical reflections on research ethics when working in the field of the anthropology of morality. If my description of this hospital is a banal one for us as individuals, or on the contrary seems appalling, if the culture shock leads you to judge it poorly as human beings, or on the contrary, excuse it, how about us as anthropologists and sociologists? If the culture shock caused by the other pushes the general public to make moral statements and produce moral reactions, what sort of reaction or engagement should an anthropologist have? How neutral and purely descriptive our position could and should be? Does the anthropology of morality help to reinforce cultural relativism through its attention to plurality and its disentangling of moral complexity that shall boil down almost to the level of idiosyncrasy and individual rationale? Or does it, on the contrary, incite to engagement in the name of universal human rights and moral standards? And finally, is this kind of anthropological approach not neutral in scope, but nonetheless political in practice? If we put aside analysis of social reality in terms of power and turn towards analysis in terms of values, is anthropology really changing and offering an alternative, a clearer view on reality, while still remaining engaged with the social, without being programmatic or normative or embracing the new forms of global militantism? Michael Lombeck highlights in the introduction to his volume on ordinary ethics the contemporary relevance of ethical questions. I quote, "One of the questions implicitly raised is whether and how ordinary ethical sensibilities are coarsened or heightened with respect to broad social forces such as consumer capitalism, media advertising, inequality, violence, and specific forms of discipline such as boot camp army training." Contributions to Lombeck's volume attempt to avoid the relativist universalist debates involved in cross-cultural moral judgments, notably in human rights debates, namely to stay away from normative judgments and avoid reductionist explanations. One cannot support this stance. One cannot but support this stance. Even so, two questions arise here. First, whether it is possible to maintain the intent of avoiding the normative implications of an ethnographic analysis. And second, whether eliminating rationalist terms of explanation from analysis will not totally blind us to scientific facts. With the focus on ordinary versus extraordinary actions, the absence or insignificance of a deviant component alleviates the problem of the neutrality of the observer by reducing the weight of the issues at stake. But Can this neutral position be maintained when it is confronted with exceptionally deviant events? Suicide bombers, ethnic cleansing, Trump's election. Didier Fassin addresses these problems more overtly. He places himself in a project that has political echoes, which makes us wonder sometimes whether, despite the change of focus from the political to the moral, we are not actually back again to analysis in terms of power through the political use of the power of moral discourses. This is chiefly because of the difficulty of maintaining scientific neutrality. Can anthropology maintain its descriptive function and ethical neutrality when addressing conflicts on a global scale? Nancy Shepherd-Hughes maintains that it cannot, and she argues for a militant anthropology. For her, silence is a form of collaboration, a suspension of ethical judgment, a human, if not a professional fault. Her ethical engagement was crucial in the denunciation of networks of organ sellers, and the courage of her personal position cannot be but applauded. However, her position is incompatible with embracing a positivist scientific perspective that requires neutrality. But let us think anew. Isn't it a new form of abuse to impose Western ethical requirements and condemn the other society and traditions without considering their past and the beliefs of the society's women and men? The collective character of values supported in these societies should give them weight and lead the anthropologist to question what generated values thousands of years ago and what caused them to survive over time. It is interesting to note the distance that Sabah Mahmood takes towards both her earlier writings and secular feminism in the introduction to her book, Politics of Piety, written after she had studied pietist movements in Egypt. Despite our vows of objectivity as anthropologists, we cannot but remain anchored in our own values, and as a result, are unable to adhere simultaneously to different sets of contradictory values. Therefore, our capacity to remain neutral is questionable. Only a profound respect for all manifestations of life and human culture could help us hold to some principle of neutrality, and only attention given to methodology is able to ensure that we conduct our work with the intention of revealing the truth. Far from the above being abstract commandments, Uni Vikan answers the challenge through a thick analysis of the Fadime case, a crime of honor that took place in a Kurdish family in Sweden. With the precision of a court judgment, as an advocate representing the two moral worlds she knows equally well, Vikan tries to understand the crime of honor, the crime of a father who killed his daughter Fadime years after the contentious subject, Fadime's Swedish boyfriend, had died in an accident. Knowing the anthropologist's previous work, which reveals the Norwegian state's incapacity to protect immigrant girls from their traditional fate, as decided by men, one can understand the strenuous effort Uni Vikan made to remain neutral against her own moral positions. Vikan leaves to philosophers the task of deciding how to manage cultural relativism, and limits her task to revealing all the issues at stake in a real case study. If the will to relativize Western values takes us away from a militant position, it should not necessarily lead to disengagement. The choice of research subjects, if attuned to the interests of the society studied, is an ethical one, because it helps in revealing contradictions and conflicts that could inform subsequent normative decisions in the
Recording in progress.
To conclude, in this talk, I have started with the case of the Children's Hospital to highlight some of the methodological challenges facing anthropologists of morality and enable us to navigate more easily through theoretical assertions, with no pretense of analyzing in depth the context and reaching conclusions about the nature of the professional relations in Romanian hospitals. Our time here and the material I have displayed are not enough to enable to do that. The boundaries of the ethnographic context that supports the explanation of a single moral fact are very large. Indeed, they are as large as used to be covered in a traditional monograph. How much context is available and used could change the interpretation of a moral controversy. The message I would like to leave now at the beginning of such a promising conference is that a critical mass of ethnographic data is necessary before embarking on the analysis and interpretation of the moral dimensions of social life in any particular setting or domain of local activity. Let me say that the methodological and ethical challenges I have evoked should be considered as challenges and motives for going on and do research on ethics, and not as obstacles impossible to go over. This also means that an engaged position that an anthropologist could have in this field is towards the seriousness, objectivity, and neutrality of scholarship, all consequences already following directly from there. Producing sound scholarship is a moral engagement we can take on as scholars. It is the engagement that brings us here and the most precious world citizenship engagement to have. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, Mônica, por essa fala densa, ilustrada e, ao mesmo tempo, enormemente generosa. Normalmente, nesses momentos, em conferências presenciais, a gente teria um sonoro aplauso soando na audiência. Infelizmente, o Zoom não permite ainda o recurso do aplauso coletivo plenamente significativo, mas eu tenho certeza de que falo por todos aqui presentes, expressando que há um aplauso sonoro ao final da sua fala. Vou passar, sem mais delongas, para a reação, para os comentários do professor Luís Roberto Cardoso de Oliveira, nosso comentarista de hoje. O professor Luís Roberto é professor titular do Departamento de Antropologia da Universidade de Brasília e do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Direito da mesma universidade. É subcoordenador no Instituto de Estudos Comparados e Administração de Conflitos, INEAC, e tem experiência no Brasil, nos Estados Unidos e no Canadá e na França, com ênfase nos seguintes temas: direito, cidadania, democracia, políticas de reconhecimento e conflito. É um grande amigo e um dos mais importantes antropólogos brasileiros. Eu gostaria de acrescentar ao final da minha apresentação. Luís Roberto, a palavra está com você. Muito obrigado.
Well, I'm going to make my comments in English. I'm just going to compliment everyone first in Portuguese as well. Bom dia a todos. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour, Monica Heintz. It's a pleasure for me to be here, to have been invited to comment on a very interesting talk. As I was saying, it is a very interesting conference approaching at least 6
Recording in progress.
Of the anthropological literature on the theme, with a special focus on publications in English. You make a very good point on the limits of ethno-ethic approaches to deal with moral questions. For mapping out explicit norms, rules, and moral values may be ethnographically enriching, but does not say much about the core of moral issues. From my point of view, and I think to a great extent connected to your talk, I would define the moral ethical universe as relating questions of what is right or correct, what is adequate or appropriate, and what is just or fair, encompassing questions of justice and ideals of the good. Secondly, the story of nurses and mothers at the Romanian Children's Hospital is a good starting reference to show the complexity of ordinary moral problems and the need for adequate contextualization. At the vantage point of a mother with her child in the hospital is also very interesting, and I appreciate that. But let us move on to the 6 points I indicated above. First, you talk about the limits of neutrality as a recurrent theme throughout the presentation. And it is another point well taken in your conference. But I would argue that indicating its limits may not be enough to assess the problems coming out of neutral perspectives. In my view, neutrality seems to be completely inappropriate to deal with moral issues. One should or could perhaps talk about impartiality, but neutrality supposes that one can approach moral problems without presuppositions as a blank slate, for instance. I don't think that you were saying this, but connecting your discussion with the concept of neutrality, I think it does have implications in this direction. Actually, I would say that that would be a problem concerning any effort at interpreting the social world as a role. Neutrality comes out in your talk, contrasting descriptive and normative approaches, contrasting neutrality and engagement. Also, when differentiating between moral and immoral or morally neutral facts. And it comes out again in critical reflections on and research ethics, and in contrasting scientific neutrality versus engagement. In terms of descriptive, contrasting descriptive and normative approaches, I would ask you, is it possible to describe without assessing the justifications of subjects when making sense of actions, disputes, and the respective outcomes? As it's usually mentioned in French sociology from Durkheim onwards, I mean, the social is a moral universe. Social relations have always a moral dimension, and the social sciences themselves have moral implications. So I think that the effort to taking up something happened in my camera. Now it's on again. I don't know what happened, but well, I'm sorry about that anyway. But as I was saying, the concern about not taking up ethnocentric normative stances on doing research is of course a main objective of the social sciences. But I think one must take, in order to make sense of social actions and of moral actions, one has to look at the subject's discourse on how do they make sense, and the way they make sense must make sense as well for the understanding of the anthropologists or the sociologists, and in doing that, it's very difficult to achieve such understanding without exposing oneself to normative claims, to moral and ethical claims. And so being neutral doesn't make sense to me. And I would give as an example, for instance, the book by Botanski and Teveno on justification that just came out in Portuguese, and actually in a very good translation of Alexandre Werneck. But they make an effort to look at actors' justifications and make an assessment of such justifications through the banner of the critique of the critique. I think it goes in the same way in connection to the contrast between neutrality and engagement. I think one must try to be impartial, and by that I mean in order to be impartial, one must not put away any comments or critiques without addressing the comments and the critiques, without explaining why it does make or it does not make sense. I think one can be impartial when one makes an effort to do that. But being impartial is quite different than being neutral, that, as I said before, would suggest that one can look at things as from a blank slate. I mean, without presuppositions. This is also connected to, I jumped something here, to your discussion on neutrality versus engagement. And you mentioned the very polemic work of Nancy Scheper-Hughes, not only her article, The Primacy of the Ethical, but her production in general is very polemic. I think she does like to be polemical. But what I want to say is that in that one article, The Primacy of the Ethical, sometimes I think that she takes too much the position of the spokesperson, that to talk for the subjects. And I think that it may be ethically problematical to do that. It's one thing to be critical. I think it's another thing to place oneself in a position of to tell the subjects, just exaggerating a bit what she says, but to tell the subjects what they should do. Nancy Scheper-Hughes is also very polemic in how she deals with her research on trafficking organs, because it's one thing to be critical to the trafficking of human organs, and it's quite different to allow oneself as a researcher to collaborate with the police to denounce subjects of research. I think it's a major ethical problem in terms of research ethics. I mean, you may pronounce yourself in a very critical way, I think, in connection to trafficking organs, but it's a quite different thing to allow oneself to denounce one's own subject of research to the police. And she tries to justify that. But I don't know the work of Wickens that you mentioned towards the end of your talk. And her position was much more interesting, as you said yourself in your talk. I mean, in trying to evaluate the situation without, I mean, being critical from my point of view, but without taking up a political position in that one case. The only difference I would suggest is I would classify, if I understood her correctly, but I would justify her position on that as trying to be impartial but not neutral. Actually, she, by your description, she understands in very interesting ways the situation because she has a background that allows her to connect the different positions at stake in this one issue. Well, going ahead, I mean, besides discussing the place of neutrality, you talk also about cross-culturally universal definitions of morality. I think that it's not really a major issue for anthropology or sociology to look for substantive categories of norms or values that one would find everywhere in the world. But and I'm not saying you say so, but I just contextualizing my understanding of the discussion. But I think one should look at how subjects make sense of moral actions, of moral positions in administering disputes. And I agree completely with your suggestion that it's much easier to look at moral questions when one observes breaches or disputes instead of looking at moral confirmation. Because these are actually the situations in which subjects are more motivated to explain and elaborate and about their moral conceptions. In this regard, I mean, talking about cross-cultural or universal definitions of morality, I also think one should make a difference between native categories and concepts. It's the fact that, as you pointed out very well in your talk, in connection with works on linguistics and comparing different languages that do have concepts for morality and ethics and languages that do not. But the fact that one or other language may not have a concept for morality, it does not mean, as you said yourself, that moral issues are not important there. And I think that trying to devise a sufficiently broad concept that allows one to make sense of different manifestations of moral problems is an interesting anthropological or sociological effort. So as I said in the beginning, that one should make an effort to how subjects look at what is correct, incorrect, adequate, or appropriate, or fair, or justice, or just. And I think the social scientists should look at how subjects try to explain their views on these issues, and the social scientists should be concerned about how, to what extent, what the subjects say and connected to actually to how they act as well. Show events of arbitrariness or not. I think that if one looks at discourses on norms and values, or sometimes better than looking at norms and values, but looking at how they justify outcomes of disputes. If the reasons they bring to their explanation do not show any sign of arbitrariness, I think they do have a good claim that it could be justified with an intention of having this explanation universalized. What I mean, I also think I have not said anything yet before on this specific issue, but I think it's one thing to look at universal norms or values, and another thing is to allow oneself to question to what extent specific justifications have a potential to be universalized as a fair justification for what has happened in the eyes of anyone who is sufficiently informed to what have gone through. So that's so much for cross-culturally universal definitions of morality. I would go in the same way for looking at breaches, and instead of moral confirmation, I'm in complete agreement with your suggestions in your talk. So I'm going to move on to the connection between emotions and moral claims. I have myself been concerned about the connection between emotions and rights and moral issues. And I think that there are certain aggressions to rights that really do not become intelligible if one is not able to connect them to meanings that come out from emotions. But having said that, and looking at the way you approach the problem in your talk, it doesn't seem to me that the naturalistic approach has much to say about emotions in connection to morality. Facial expressions, for instance, that you call attention in connection to the works of Nichols. Facial expressions or brain activity, if one can evaluate that, it may show a correlation between what happens in one's body and reactions of indignation, for instance. But it does not say much, really, I think, to how one makes sense of that indignation or of that reaction of indignation. It contrasts, I think, in a very strong way with different efforts of connecting emotions and morality, as G.P. Thompson's work, which is very interesting, and his connection with peasants' moral economy. Yet I think it's a much richer way looking at how emotions can make moral issues intelligible, then the naturalistic approach, which from my view do not add a bit, I must say, to our understanding of what moral reactions mean. You also, I must say that I've tried to chronometrize my time here, but I lost. I don't know for how long I've been talking. I know I should not go too long, but anyway, if someone can tell me for how long I've been talking, I would appreciate that. But you also make it how much?
22 minutes.
23 minutes. You also make very interesting points on connection to freedom and morality. And I think that it's a very important and interesting issue, but I felt that in order to go deeper in the meaning of freedom connected to moral issues, I think one does have to connect it to moral obligation. It's very difficult to make sense of moral issues from a sociological or anthropological viewpoint without looking at moral obligations. And I think that that the idea of freedom does not make much sense, I mean, connecting to morality, if it's not paired in one way or another with the idea of moral obligations. I'm thinking mostly here of the classic work of Marcel Mauss on the gift, which is very convincing in many ways about, but especially I think in this connection, and I would say it's I'm missing the proper word now, but it's an unavoidable fact. I mean that freedom and obligation go together in moral issues. I skipped one thing that I had noted to say before, but I bring it up now. That it's still about neutrality. Because at one point you suggest that it's interesting to distinguish moral facts for non-moral facts and immoral facts. And I would ask, what is an immoral fact? I mean, are there non-moral social relations? Well, finally, you also talk about the importance of looking at the importance of assessing, of differences in the assessment of the data collected by anthropologists. If the data comes from statements made spontaneously by subjects, or if it comes from interviews, and one could think of many different situations where the social scientist collects his or her data. But my point is that in anthropological fieldwork, that is one major characteristic is the situation of immersion in the field, as you showed yourself when you talked about the Children's Hospital in Romania. These are situations in which the anthropologist takes up many different identities. I mean, when you were in the hospital, most of the time that you were relating to the mothers, they were not addressing you as a researcher, I'm sure on that. And there are other situations in which it's reasonable that your interlocutors will looked at you as a researcher, anthropologist, and however they understand it, that's sometimes it does not make much sense to our interlocutors everywhere. But what I want to say is that one interesting thing of field work in the situation of immersion is that the anthropologist has the opportunity to get in touch with the theme of his or her research in many different contexts, in many different situations, and being addressed with many different identities as well. And I think the product of such an experience is that the anthropologist is ideally able to contextualize the data in two ways, at least. One way is looking at the specific situation under examination. And the other way is taking advantage of that broad experience in the field and contextualizing this specific situation in the broad context of the field experience as a whole. Well, my point is that if the specific data in question came from a spontaneous manifestation of a subject, from a response to an interview, from a situation in which the anthropologist overheard conversations of other subjects, which is very interesting in many ways in fieldwork experience. And one could bring up many other situations that add to that whole package that I'm trying to build here. And I think that the main concern of the anthropologist must be to contextualize it properly, taking under consideration these two dimensions, if I may say so, of context, the specific context and the context at large. But I'm finishing now my my comments. I would just like to add that it was a pleasure for me to be able to read your conference, a very interesting one, and I do not expect that now you have to place yourself in a position to respond everything that I brought up in our interaction here that unfortunately has to be just virtual now. I thank you for your presentation and congratulate you on your conference. I finish here.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether it's me or...
Sim, Mônica. Obrigado, Luís. Eu vou passar, então, agora a palavra de volta para a Mônica, para ela responder o que ela quiser responder dos comentários de Luís. Fica à vontade, Mônica, a palavra está com você.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much indeed. You definitely have to tell me how many minutes I have, because that was such a rich comment. Thank you so much. And I think my only answer to most of your comments would be, oh, I really have to find what you have published in languages that I learn, or learn Portuguese. That should not be so difficult for a Romanian to learn Portuguese. Because I was thrilled by some of the comments you have made. I will try to answer some of the things that are maybe most obvious or maybe most important somehow in what you're saying. And the first one is, thank you very much for this note on neutrality, because I didn't explain why I use neutrality and not impartiality as a term. But there is a reason for this. So I'm sorry I didn't explain it. And I just realized as you were talking that I didn't formulate it somehow in a comprehensive way for myself. So let me have a go here. For me, impartiality is about not trying to take sides, while neutrality is also about not trying to think ahead that the problem to which you are confronted is morally loaded. And that is very much linked to what I was saying about the distinction between a fact that is belongs to the moral real, is something that is moral or immoral, and something that is not amenable to a judgment in terms of judgment of wrong. A convention also, if I was making noise during this Zoom, for instance, and I wasn't supposed to do so, you would kick me out, and that would not be considering me as being a completely immoral person. I would be rejected from the community because that is an embarrassment, and because conventionally one should cut his micro. So that for me, in this context, at least in the French context, this is something that is a neutral fact. It goes to a rejection, so it's going to be a rejection from the community, but it's neutral. And actually what I'm referring to cross-cultural definitions and why those are important is because I have also read some of the works that had been done around moral dilemmas in cross-cultural context. And this is chiefly a work done by cognitive scientists of morality, of course, but with the help of anthropologists who went to different field sites, and they had these moral dilemmas, and they had to find a way to find what is a moral dilemma in Italy. Is not something that is a moral dilemma somewhere else. Thomas Whitlock has written about his experience among, sorry, the name is a Bushman, but it's not Akoi, it's now the name, in Namibia. And he went there with some of the dilemmas that seem to be not concerning moral issues, dilemmas concerning the share of land or the passing through a land of a person who had to go quickly to her home. And some things that all of us, for us, was morally neutral, an issue, seems there to be completely overheated and people were taking sides and people were being partial about it. And that was a moral issue there, why it wouldn't have been here. So again, when I talk about neutrality as opposed to impartiality, is also so that I take a neutral stance while writing and not in the field, and not upload with moral or immoral values something that I have seen in the field, which I would tend to do, because of course I have my own notions of morality or immorality. To go deeper into my experience that was led in Romania, as you can imagine, I was extremely heated and I was absolutely partial when I was in the field. Of course, I was partial. I was on the mother's side and I was absolutely outraged when I was there. My neutrality was something that I had to fight to gain in the writing stage afterwards. That's when I tried to look at the justifications that nurses were giving to me or to which I had access indirectly. It's not the direct nurses I was confronted with, but other nurses to whom I talked during my stay there that gave me information that made me find a way to deal with their justification of their behavior as well as with justification of the mothers. But when I was there, I was taking sides. Of course, I didn't understand. Yes, that neutrality, of course, is not there in the field. Of course, when we go into the field, when we are connected to the society and we share their value, their judgment of that event as being morally loaded, we do take sides. I mean, we are not even partial. But it's a very, very interesting thing to deal with, and for me to explain further and to deepen. So thank you very much for this. Another thing maybe that I think it would be nice to come so that there would be no misunderstanding about my talk here, is that when I say go beyond ethnoethics, that means taking into account also practices. That doesn't mean neglecting discourses, not neglecting the discourses on principles, and not neglecting the justifications that are post-facto justification. Of course, those are facts that they enter into my scheme, and I have to take them into account. Anyway, I spent my time talking with people in order to provoke them to say things. I was taking sides, of course, and I was telling other stories so that people can react. I was provoking, taking part in moral discussions. So for me, talk is very important, of course. But in order to grasp the difference between ought and is, and look at the is as well, and not just at principles and justifications. Also, thank you for your comment on the link to emotions and how much E.P. Thompson can help me, but the cognitive sciences of morality can't. I think I shouldn't develop here in this, because I do have my own views on how there could be a dialogue with more naturalistic approaches. I don't want to defend it here, and I'm not ready to defend it here. But yeah, I do think it's useful to look into cognitive sciences, principally because of the attention they give to emotion and the fact that they can give us some tools, additional tools that I don't have now. Just also to confirm some of the things that you have said, and I was so glad to hear it, because of course I didn't put that in a paper, but you can find it in the book. The book that just came out and that Alexander Wernick just showed you is a book in which I just make a plea for using case studies, situated case studies, those that have context, but without neglecting the ethnography. And this is one of the reasons why I do use case studies from, well, same societies. I'm not picking up case studies from everywhere, so that when related, when put together, when recreated, this whole ethnographic context that a monography is able to reconstruct, then you'd understand things that the analysis of one single case study wouldn't allow you to. Because of course, when I analyze even one single case study, I don't draw just on the specifics of that case study. I draw on the whole experience that I have about that specific society. So yes, thank you very much. That comforts me very much, because yeah, it's a choice. It's a methodological choice and the choice of writing this case study plus ethnography thing. What else shall I say? Well, again, maybe to correct, when I was talking about freedom and how much freedom we should evaluate, and I was quoting James Laidlaw and James Straub as well, and these people who insist on the fact that researching freedom and will is indispensable for researching morality. And I was saying, well, this is a very much Western view that comes from the attention that the Western world gives to the individual. I do not work in the Western world, neither can I come originally from the Western world, so I am much more caught into the moral obligations that we have, and much more aware that the scale at which we should be looking at things is not necessarily the individual one. It's not either the society one, could be the family, could be more than that, could be, well, the mafia has all sorts of moral rules that are elaborated at the family level, not at the individual level, for instance, and that they are so against what the moral values of the community or the society in which it is embedded have. So the question of freedom for me is not really an entry because of those various scales. And this is why I insist much more on the need for looking at interactions and looking at interactions between these different scales and between people at these different conundrums in which they are entangled. So that I think I should stop here, because I'll probably not be able to cover everything, but just to go back to the issue of neutrality that sort of was crossing also your remarks. And I'm sure that is something that concerns us all, because we all would like to be engaged. I come from a tradition of engagement in the way I practice anthropology. So I do consider that I'm engaged. I look at things that matter. Well, I don't look at funny things in general, but on socially disturbing things, because I'm engaged with the society in which I live. To put it further, the question of neutrality, I brought it somehow ahead because I have seen so much moralization. We live in moralizing societies. Everything is being moralized. For the right, yeah, of course, for the support of right ideas. So in order to avoid this sort of moralization also in the field of the anthropology of morality, yes, it is my choice to insist somehow that we need to not to take sides and to be neutral even in our way of determining ahead what is to be a moral issue. So, okay, that would be from me. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if I haven't covered everything, but that was so rich. Thank you.
Nós é que agradecemos, Mônica. Quero, mais uma vez, então, reforçar que os aplausos daquele momento se repitam agora, não tanto para a sua resposta quanto para a fala anterior de Luís Roberto. A gente está chegando, então, ao final dessa nossa primeira parte do nosso seminário. Quero agradecer imensamente a participação da professora Mônica Heintz, da Universidade de Paris-Nanterre, do professor Luís Roberto Cardoso de Oliveira, da Universidade de Brasília, e convidar a todos para a continuação da nossa programação, que está listada em nosso site, mas que nós retomaremos às 14h30 com a primeira mesa, com a mesa 1, Moral e Teoria Social, que contará com a presença de Luís Roberto Cardoso de Oliveira e Alexandre Werneck, este que vos fala. Além de nós, Frederic Vandenberg, da UFRJ, e Patrício Schuch, da Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul. Isso cobrirá a programação da tarde, e à noite teremos os 2 primeiros grupos de trabalho, com trabalhos de alunos de pós-graduação de todo o Brasil. Mais uma vez, muito obrigado pela presença e nos vemos adiante. Que esta semana, que esses dias de seminário sejam produtivos, interessantes e estimulantes para todos. Mais uma vez, muito obrigado.